All right, welcome back, guys, to another tactical podcast. Today, we're coming at you with a really special guest, someone who's right up our alley, Justin Black from Spycraft 101. Justin Black is on Instagram at Spycraft 101, also on Facebook, same thing, Spycraft 101. And Justin, I started following you kind of a little bit earlier on in your Instagram career, and you've just double, tripled, quadrupled your followers seemingly overnight, man, from the really awesome historical examples of tradecraft and espionage that you put on. It's really great, and the way you do it is really fascinating. It's kind of different than a lot of guys do it. You give historical examples about, cool stuff that has happened before from the old Cold War history and all of that, and you really let us know kind of the backstory behind these things. So, Justin, bro, appreciate you coming on. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, we were talking a little bit before the podcast, and you've got over 20 years in the military and then 10 plus years in the intelligence community in general, and I'll leave it at that. But you do have training and experience in human intelligence collection, counterintelligence, intelligence analysis. You've worked on intelligence ops in the Mideast, Asia, Central America, and in addition to all of this incredibly awesome James Bond stuff, dude, you also are a amateur historian, which is really what your passion is the history behind all of this stuff. Now, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into the history and all of that?
Sure. Well, history in general has been a real interest of mine, just, from a very young age. And before I even joined the intelligence community, when I was still in just a standard, line unit in the military, I started reading up some of the books that I now recommend through my Instagram page. And I really just opened my eyes to a whole other layer of the world, things that are going on that most people they don't have a clue about. And I think a lot of my readership now, people that are naturally drawn to the stories that I tell, they have peeked behind that curtain, or they've lived behind that curtain, as a matter of fact. But your average, Joe Q public kind of person, they have probably walked right past something going on in their daily life, and they never had a clue. You know what I mean? That's the kind of thing that you talk about on your own podcast and on your Instagram page as well. People are not situationally aware. And so I like to bring a little more awareness to what's really going on in the world, how nations really interact, the kind of people that we generally will never know their names, but they're the ones that shape our history, and we benefit from it, or it's to our detriment, but they kind of live in the shadows, and they are the ones that are really pulling the levers on this world.
And it's been that way since, the biblical times, man. They say espionage is the second oldest profession. I think we can all guess what the first might be, but it's not espionage. But you talk about that in the Bible, man. Within the first couple of books, you're hearing all about these different operations with the 12 spies in Deuteronomy and even in Joseph. And it really is the oldest and one of the most prestigious professions out there. So when we talk about historical examples of this, we don't even have to just look back to the Cold War. We can look back as long as humans have been recording history and see that these operations have been going on.
That's absolutely right. And, I've started touching on that through my account. A lot of it has been very Cold War centric, just because, when you're starting with Instagram as your platform, you need to start with a good photo. Yeah. And, we can't go back to ancient Japan for a good photo, of course, but you're right. Deception is a part of human nature. Betrayal is a part of human nature. Undeserved trust is a part of human nature as well. So there are techniques that have been used because human nature has not changed in millennia. So there are techniques that have been used and strategies that have been implemented that, people from the Bible, from Deuteronomy, just like you mentioned, they would recommend things that are going on in the world right now. They would recognize the intent and the meaning and the weakness that's being exploited, I think. So I like to touch on that kind of thing. I like to go back as far as I can, but also, starting on Instagram, it is a tough platform to tell stories. It's not a story-centric platform, which is why I'm moving on as well from there.
And I think that's a great thing as well. Now, speaking about stories, I was looking on your Instagram page, and there is a link to a book. And this book is about the Joint Special Operations. Is this your book that you've written or something that you're simply recommending?
No, that's something I'm recommending. That's by Sean Naylor, and he is, he's a role model for me, quite frankly, because he's a tremendous author. He's been with Army Times, as a matter of fact. He's been a reporter for Army Times for many years, and I picked up this book a year or two ago, read through it. It's really something that kind of sings to me, I guess you could say, and I think it will sing a lot to my readership as well. So that's why I've been recommending it for quite some time now.
And when you talk about Instagram not being conducive necessarily to storytelling and everything, and I do think that you have a unique perspective on this, a unique angle on this, I should say. As I mentioned before, what made you decide to get into the Instagram game versus the YouTube game?
Well, yeah, I've never tried YouTube. It might be something that I do later on. There are definitely some directions I want to pursue with this as time goes by. I started with Instagram just because I felt like I had a few photos to start with. I had 5 or 6 things that I wanted to tell, and I decided, let me give this a shot with Instagram. I opened up a Facebook page, but didn't really pursue it. It's there, but it's not really active, not like my Instagram account is. And, for whatever reason, this one has just really taken off. I had a few people right off the bat who started sharing my posts, who started advocating for me. I think I kind of struck a nerve with some of the material that I'm providing. So that led me to really focusing on that for the first few months. So I've only been at the game for about 3 months now, but as you can see, it's really grown quickly. A lot of people they seem to enjoy reading this material as much as I enjoy reading it, as much as I enjoy researching it.
People love espionage. People love the James Bond thing. I mean, if you go to the Spy Museum in DC, you can't even get in sometimes. There's lines around the block. It's just one of those things that I don't care who you are, you love a good spy story, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I've been there recently. As a matter of fact, I went right after they reopened again, and I got lucky because there was no one there the first time, so I was able to really take my time the first couple of hours in the morning. And I've also established contact with one of their special exhibits curators there, and she's been able to answer a few questions, which have led to better, more insightful Instagram posts so far.
Oh, that's really cool. Now,
yeah, she's actually reached out to Keith Melton, and if you read my posts, if you read anything about espionage, you'll probably know who Keith Melton is. He's on the board of directors at the Spy Museum, and I'm really hoping that she'll facilitate a meeting at some point, but that hasn't happened yet.
Well, keep me in touch about that, man. That's something I'd like to see a lot.
Absolutely.
So I know you do a lot of posting about the Cold War, and you mentioned that that's simply because there's a lot of relevant information. That was the glory days of espionage. CIA, KGB, black spy, white spy, fighting each other, in the cartoons. But, even going back during World War II, the OSS, right? And for those of you guys who aren't familiar with the OSS, it's the Office of Strategic Services. That was a precursor to the CIA. That's what the CIA was before CIA come about. And Justin, I know that you and I were talking offline a little bit about that, and you said, yeah, I'm aware about it. I know what it is, and I've actually got some good information I could share about that. So, with that being said, man, I could talk about it, but I think you probably, as a historian and somebody kind of with more insider information here, so to speak, could probably give us a little bit better of a description than that, and let us know how kind of CIA came out of the OSS and a little bit about what they did back in the day.
Sure. I can speak to that a little bit. So the OSS, like you mentioned, it's an incredible organization. They really just sprung out of nowhere. They sprung out of necessity, but there was no significant precursor to the OSS before the start of World War II. We didn't really have any kind of a federalized spy service. We had called upon people to commit espionage as crises arose and as we got into wars all the way back to the Kulper Ring during the Revolutionary War. But those organizations, they just disbanded. There was not really any institutional knowledge that was passed along or anything. So, these guys, they just made it up as they went along, starting in 1942. The OSS only existed for about a little more than 3 years, something like 39 months, I think. And they left their mark in a way that is almost impossible to describe, really. Dulles, Wild Bill Donovan, these guys, just some incredible cowboy types, some reckless guys, but some daring guys for sure. They spun this out of nothing. They were working out of temporary offices all over Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. They were doing training in Boy Scout camps in the National Forests. That's where they were doing their sabotage training. They funded the scientists, and they funded all of these different engineering firms and design firms all over the place just to come up with anything they could. They tried a wide variety of disguised weaponry and sabotage tools and spying implements. A lot of it didn't work. It makes for some really good posts because it's kind of zany ideas, but it didn't really work out in the end. I've posted about some of their stuff before, like they had a poison dart gun that they were experimenting with. They've created a dart firing 1911. I think that's a post that I made a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
They had a type of explosive. It was not a plastic explosive. It was a powdered explosive that was shipped in paper wheat sacks, so that it just appeared that you had a 5-pound sack of wheat with you, and then you could put a fuse in that, or you could wet it down and shape it into a shaped explosive. And that was just a very surreptitious kind of explosive, easily transported. They put it to use all over Eastern Europe, all over the Western Front during World War II. So they were a very action-oriented organization. They were as much about sabotage, guerrilla warfare, assassinations, as they were about intelligence collection, for sure. And just like all the organizations before them, once the war ended, they were disbanded. And of course, the leaders of the OSS at the time, they fought against the disbanding because they saw what was coming. They saw the Iron Curtain slamming down through Eastern Europe. They knew that we couldn't trust the Soviet Union. They knew that there were always going to be threats, but those threats those proclamations, those prophecies kind of fell on deaf ears in the post-war period. We were disbanding, whole divisions of the military. We were putting all these ships in mothballs, and they decided we didn't need a strategic intelligence service anymore. So for about a 2-year period after September of 1945, we didn't have a central intelligence service of any sort. Eventually in 1947, Truman decided that it was time to create a central intelligence agency, which is the CIA, which sprung out of that decision by Truman. And at the time, he was not looking for an organization to conduct sabotage, assassination, influence operations, anything like that. Truman, what he really wanted was a newspaper. He wanted a daily newspaper that an intelligence organization would publish for him every morning, and it would just tell him what's going on in the world, because, of course, that's the kind of thing that the president needs to know. Well, there were some elements of the brand new CIA that had come up in the OSS, and they decided they wanted to do a lot more than publish a newspaper. One of those guys in particular was Frank Wisner, and I haven't talked about Frank Wisner yet through Instagram, but I definitely need to devote some space to him. He was the guy that believed in the sentry killing, in the dog killing, in the targeted assassinations, in the poison, in everything. And he didn't want to answer to anyone. So Frank Wisner very quickly was able to get a black budget where he didn't answer to anybody. He shut off all of the directors of the brand new CIA. There were, just some admin guys. They were not hardened intelligence operatives that were at the top at this time. He was able to compartmentalize his operations. He was able to shut those guys out. And he got to work doing just about every paranoid CIA thing that you can imagine these days. And so there's, I need to look into that guy a lot more because there's a lot to tell there for sure. And I will tell that at some point. But he was the guy that started CIA down this path where in some circles, of course, internationally, they're seen as some of the greatest villains on the world stage. And he was the guy that decided that they were not going to be just about intelligence collection. They were going to be about direct and indirect action.
Wow.
So he created, he called his office the Office of Policy Coordination. So Office of Policy Coordination, that's the blandest name that you can imagine, and it covered the most heinous, sinister kind of stuff that anybody could think of.
Huh.
But it was under the American flag, so I guess that makes it okay.
Oh, it makes it just fine. Yeah, of course.
Right.
So am I correct in saying that the British were really instrumental in helping us establish our intelligence services?
Yeah, I would say so in a lot of ways. And that's something I want to explore more as well. But we have taken a ton of cues from Special Operations Executive. That was our British counterpart during World War II. MI5, MI6, MI9 later on as well. MI9, I just talked about them 2 days ago, I think. They were kind of the Q branch. Essentially, they were the guys that were coming up with the devices and all that during World War II for the Special Operations Executive and for MI5 and MI6 afterwards. But yeah, I mean, they were the pioneers in so many ways. I mean, we have looked to the British for centuries, really, for direction because they've been so much more established than we have. We established Delta Force based on Charles Beckwith's time with SAS in Malaysia. He came back from there. I think it was the late 1950s. I'm not a Delta Force expert by any means, but I think he came back from Malaysia in the 1950s and saw that the SAS was doing everything that the U.S. was not but should be. So, we can very comfortably and confidently look to the Brits for guidance in a lot of things, I think. So, yeah, we definitely took a lot of direction from them and modeled our intelligence operations and our organizations after some of theirs.
We're talking about developing our tradecraft in the United States, and some would say, certainly from an outsider's perspective, I would say we've got to be, some of the best in the world at obtaining intelligence. Now, are there countries that still to this day do it better than us? If so, what do they do better? What do we do best as a nation?
Yeah, so we are not the best at everything. We're pretty good at a lot of things, but we are definitely outpaced in some ways. The Russians, going back all the way to the days of the Czechists, talking about the early 1900s, they have had human locked down in a way that's human intelligence. They've had human intelligence collection locked down in a way that we probably never have and never will. And some of that is, I guess, cultural. And I'm not a Russian culture expert, so I don't want to dive too much into that. There's probably people that would know better about that than I do. But they are more naturally secretive, naturally paranoid than we are. And for good reason. In the espionage game, you almost cannot be too paranoid, quite frankly. And that's not a healthy way to live, but it is a realistic way to live in the intelligence community and in that world. But the Russians have always been better than us at turning people, at understanding human weaknesses, at exploiting those weaknesses, at lying just about everything and getting away from it, essentially, getting away with it, excuse me. We outpace everyone else. I can't speak to current times, but over the past 50 years, we've outpaced everyone else in technical collection. We're far, far ahead of the Soviets since the 1960s, 1970s. Most famously, probably with our satellite programs. We had the Corona satellites starting in about 1960. We had the Keyhole satellites that came online in about 1970. And a lot of our technical collection really just blew everybody's minds, and they couldn't touch us. Unfortunately, we may have over-relied on technology over the course of years. I'm certain that our SIGINT capabilities right now are pretty incredible. And so in that sense, we may have neglected the human intelligence component, or at least not given it its full due. So I think the Russians are definitely better at human intelligence than we are. And then you want to talk about the Chinese. The Chinese are very good at intelligence, that is economic intelligence. They are much better at influence than anybody else, I would say, because you ask, like I mentioned, Joe Q. Public on the street earlier, you ask those guys, a lot of them will not say that China's our enemy. China's our greatest enemy, by far. They're our most powerful adversary, and they're only going to get, I think that's just going to continue. It's going to get worse and worse in the coming years. But China, they never present themselves as our enemy, and that's their greatest strength. So they are very good at infiltrating media, infiltrating Hollywood, infiltrating education system here. I could go on and on about China, but they are not that great at the type of human intelligence collection that Russia does. They don't really, they turn some, but they don't turn very many Americans against us. Typically, they'll just typically work through, like, Chinese Americans, for example, through the immigrant population that they already have. They can already access their families back home, for example. They have a lot to lose back home in China, so they're easily influenced for that reason. But their strength is influence operations, is how I would put it. Russia's is human intelligence collection, and our best strength is technical collection.
That makes a lot of sense.
Speaking very broadly, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So talking about China real quick, and I want to stick on this subject just for a minute because it really is very relevant. I had the Continental Marine on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and he was telling us about the China's 2030 initiative, which basically they're going to try to bolster their military and kind of reorganize it in such a way that they'll be as good, if not better than us, hopefully, for them by 2030. Can you lend any credence to that? Is that something that is actively being looked at by, by CIA and MI6 and, all of our allied nations here?
I don't really have a conduit to current day operations right now. And even if I did, I wouldn't really be talking about it on Instagram. But I would say that certainly the entirety of the U.S. government is pivoting towards that threat. And even if the public is not so much aware of it, I think the U.S. government is very much aware of it. We just had a Chinese national former CIA employee who was arrested this past week. He's one of several that have been arrested. There was the Chinese Ministry of State Security agent who was arrested in San Francisco. If you saw, she was hiding out in the consulate a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if you recall that. She came here to the U.S., was posing as a student, but she was actually like a major in the Chinese Army, People's Liberation Army. So they have a lot of operations going on for sure. And I've definitely heard of the term pivot toward Asia recently. So there's a big concern. The Navy, anybody in the Navy can probably tell you about going toe-to-toe with the People's Liberation Army Navy. But that's not really my area of expertise. So I don't want to speak out of turn on it.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I think the whole of government is for sure aware of that threat, even if the public is not.
Now, just from your personal perspective, all relevant credentials aside, if you had to analyze this as a historian, would you say that at some point it would be not unrealistic that NATO might go to war with China?
I think that's unlikely. NATO is more Europe-centric to begin with, of course. But if you're talking about like any kind of like an Indo-PACOM alliance, whether it's us and Japan and South Korea versus China, that's tough to say. But certainly China is gearing up to take Taiwan, I think. I don't know, that might happen this year. It might happen in 10 years, for example. But that is very, very much an immediate strategic goal of theirs. And it really depends, I think, in who is in charge at that time in Congress, in the White House, how they want to respond. Because we've sunk a lot of money and training into Taiwan. We've sunk a lot of money and training into South Korea and Japan as well. And are we going to let that stand on its own? Are we going to say, well, you've got F-22s over there, use them, and that's, this is a regional fight? Or are we going to totally join? And is it going to be, full-scale warfare across the Pacific? That's hard to say for sure. Probably the best book that I've read recently on that subject. It's a novel, but it's written by a couple of think tank guys from Washington, D.C. area. It's called Ghost Fleet. The book is several years old now, and it's, there's definitely some Hollywood flair that's thrown into this book, but there's also some tremendous insight into Chinese thinking, into realistic strategies, into what our responses would be, and it would be a hard fight. There's no question in my mind. We would have many, many thousands of casualties. We would probably have carriers that we would lose in the Pacific. I think that we would prevail in the end, but we would also face total economic destruction of both countries because our manufacturing pipeline shut down. So the only positive outcome of our entanglement with China economically is that they really don't want to go to war with us because they have as much to lose as we do. Yeah. In every other sense, I disagree with our manufacturing links to China, but in the sense that they probably don't want to lose their economy along with ours, that's probably the only good thing to come out of that. That's probably the only thing holding them back from more aggressive action in the Pacific, in my opinion.
They are a very smart people. I mean, that's where the book "The Art of War" came out of, right? So,
right, absolutely.
They know warfare. They know it, and that's something that I think is really going to be important going forward to keep our eyes on. Just as even a lot of our viewers are citizen soldier, sheepdog type of guys, cops, firemen, all that type of thing. And I think just for us local guys here stateside, it's important to look at what's going on over there to see where things are going. Now, I want to circle back real quick to the Russians' human intelligence gathering efforts. Do you think that part of it comes from that kind of and I don't want to overly blanket somebody, but they have a very cold attitude towards, people, towards like human emotions. Do you think that makes them better at gathering human intelligence? Yeah,
for sure. I mean, Stalin, he won World War II, at the cost of 20 million lives. Right. A country like that is willing to purge their officer ranks, purge undesirables, they are more, what's the way to put it? They're better adapted for the kind of manipulation that comes from needing to, use expendable human assets, basically. So that is a culture, I think, that is more in tune with death, I guess would be the best way to put it. And so they can use people and toss them away better than we can, quite frankly. We value the sanctity of life. I don't want to make them sound like savages, of course, but I think that we have a lot more of a moral threshold to cross when we talk about expendable human assets, because we've lost a lot of people in Russia, people that died horribly, because they believed in a better America. A guy that I posted about a little while back named Adolf Tokachev, he's known as the $1 billion spy, and that's a really incredible story right there. But he is a guy that he never saw America. He didn't speak English, but just everything that he learned about America made him believe in the American dream. And he decided that the best way to fight for that dream and to fight against communism was from right where he was at, in Russia. He was working in a research facility on extremely high-level military R&D projects, including Russian stealth, back in the 1970s, 1980s. So he became an incredibly valuable asset of ours. He approached the CIA directly. He approached an American at a gas station outside of the U.S. Embassy. He'd been stalking this gas station for a while, looking for an American-appearing person, and it turned out that the person that he approached was the station chief for Moscow at that time. So Tolkachev made the approach. The station chief believed that it was what's called a dangle, where they just dangle some juicy bait in front of us so we bite the hook. So he didn't engage. Tolkachev returned and returned and returned over again, and they did not engage. And finally, they decided this guy's got to be real because he keeps coming back. He keeps bringing us more. He's putting himself out there at risk, so he's got to be real. So they met with him. It turned out he had unbelievably valuable intelligence to provide. He worked for us for about 6 years until he was betrayed by Aldrich Ames in the CIA, who was working for the Russians. And so he got snatched up in 1985. He was interrogated and tortured for about a year, and then he was put on a show trial and executed the same day as the show trial. Of course, he was found guilty and he was immediately executed. So that's the kind of thing that we don't want to put someone at that risk. Typically, we experience a lot of heartache when somebody is fighting for us, even from another country. And I don't think that a lot of people in the Russian intelligence services feel the same way about their assets here in the United States. Quite frankly, they don't really care what happens to them.
We saw the spy ring busted in New Jersey, I think a couple of years back now at least, where these spies were living abnormal lives, blending in and secretly kind of going about doing their tradecraft stuff and their dead drops and all of that. How much of that do you think probably still goes on, specifically, talking about Russia, within the United States these days? Are they still very much active, the Russian intelligence stateside here?
I think that they are. There's not a lot of reporting about them. The most recent big story that I've seen was right at the end of the Obama administration. If you might recall that he kicked a lot of Russian embassy employees out of the country. Yeah. They were PNG, that's persona non grata. That's something that we do pretty frequently. They do it to us, we do it to them. But they were given 72 hours to leave the country. And they had to give up a couple of their facilities that they had purchased, like a lake retreat, I think. I don't recall the details off the top of my head, but basically that was kind of punishment for their espionage activities here in the U.S. was that about 20 or 22 of them, I think, had to leave country immediately. And that's a pretty common thing that we do to each other here and there. And I'm certain that they were conducting some sort of activity, but I can't say what it was. If you're talking about the Russian 10 that were broken up a few years ago, yeah, I know that the most famous one of them was Anna Chapman. She's a really beautiful redheaded woman. Everybody knows who Anna Chapman is. And she later on, she got her own TV show in Russia, and she appeared with Putin a few times. I guess she was his girlfriend after that. They didn't really accomplish a lot of serious espionage. They didn't dig up a lot of secrets, but they were here under our noses, living undercover for 10 years or more. There were a lot of them, and they were practicing some tradecraft. They were doing dead drops, and they had one-time cipher pads, but they didn't ultimately, they didn't strike a huge blow. The main blow, I guess, would be one of perception. That yes, we still have the Russians here. They're still digging. They can still stay under the radar for years at a time. So that was the real value of that operation for them, but they didn't collect a lot of intelligence, I don't think.
How much of that non-official cover stuff is really still done? I mean, we all know the movie The Recruit, where he talks about, Al Pacino was talking about non-official cover operatives or whatever, and you're not here on any official diplomatic passport or anything. You just kind of go out there and you talk to a handler or something like that. Now, is that something that actually still is done by other nations and maybe even ourselves, or is that kind of an old relic of history?
I think that is for sure going on. I can't really speak to specifics, and not because I want to keep it secret. It's because I don't know. I'm not read in on that kind of program to begin with, and even if I was, once again, I wouldn't talk about it. But I definitely think there's always going to be a place for traditional tradecraft, and we always need people to be working for other purposes, in other countries. That's an important part of diplomacy, is knowing what the true intentions of your allies and your adversaries are. One thing I will say is that one thing that's really making it more difficult, the traditional tradecraft, is biometrics at the airport. they make it a lot more difficult for anybody to travel under a false passport or a false identity these days, as you can well imagine, right? We're all getting our faces scanned and our thumbprints scanned and all that these days. So that's not a difficulty that's, specific to the United States. That's more difficult for everybody. The Russians have a harder time getting people here now that we have biometrics in place. So that's something to consider. And, I don't know what the workarounds are or if there are workarounds for that, but some smart people are putting their heads together on that, I'm certain.
Well, I'm sure. And I'm also sure that, here in the States, we have some pretty unsecured borders at certain sections. So I would assume that, for spies to come over that way, the old school way, you ride up in a raft or whatever would, wouldn't be out of the question either, I'm sure. So
that's absolutely true. And I don't know of any specific cases of like a strategic level trained case officer or spy coming across a border, but people from many nationalities other than Latin America are coming across the Mexican border. They're coming north, and they're coming from the Middle East. They're coming from Asia. They're coming from Central Asia, all over the place. And to what purpose, who knows? We only know when we catch them, and we don't catch most of them. That's for certain.
I do want to touch on some of these Middle Eastern organizations. Now, I specifically did a couple of briefings, just short little clips about Hezbollah and Fatah and these types of, obviously we've labeled them as terrorist organizations, and that's pretty much what they are. But do these guys over there have intelligence wings to them? And if so, do you know anything about them? How good are they?
I haven't really researched that very much. I think that they do, but they don't have the kind of technical collection that we do. Sure. But I'm certain that they have some really extensive human intelligence networks. I don't know if you're familiar with hawalas, for example. That's a method. It's sort of like a black market financing, I guess would be the best way to put it. Hawalas are a very, very common financial institution throughout the Middle East. And it's think of it as a Western Union without keeping any records, basically. So there's a tremendous amount of money that gets passed through hawalas, and it's just like informal networks of people, large bundles of cash. A lot of it is totally legitimate purposes, regular trade and mercantilism and that kind of thing. But, a lot of terrorist funding goes through those as well, and that makes it really difficult for people to track threat finance, for example. So I really have not looked into the modern terrorist organizations' intelligence collection methods. I'm certain that there's a lot to see there, and when I do find that, though, I'll definitely be posting about that as well.
That'd be great. Yeah, we really appreciate that over this way too. Speaking about them, and speaking about their funding and everything, Iran gives them a large amount of funding. In your personal opinion, how big of a threat is Iran right now? Are we looking at down the pipeline? I'll put it to you like this: in my personal opinion, I think we're going to maybe possibly see some kinetic action between Israel and Iran, and maybe even us. In your personal opinion, would that be something that you could see happening at some point potentially?
I think there's kinetic action right now. If you've been paying attention to the explosions at the nuclear facilities recently, I don't know who, but I'm going to assume Israel. Somebody has been killing a lot of people in Iran over the past few years. A lot of scientists, they love to strap those magnetic bombs to the side of a car carrying a Iranian nuclear physicist. There's been all these mysterious explosions, and I don't really know anything other than what's been in the news about that so far. But it's just odd how the Iranian nuclear program keeps getting kicked in the knees every time it starts to get off the ground. So there's kinetic action going on right now, and I don't know when it's going to get to a more open level. But if it does, honestly, it's probably going to be Israel that initiates it, because they are not afraid to kick the anthill. We've seen that many times. They've kicked their own anthill in the past, as a matter of fact. So I wouldn't call them a fair weather friend, but they are not 100% on our side. They're on their own side, and nobody else is really. But
well put, Justin. 100%. So when we're talking about Israel, you can't mention espionage and tradecraft without mentioning the Mossad. These guys are like notorious. They're crazy. Can you give us anything just from your historical perspective about, Mossad and the Israelis and the way they do things over there?
That's another place that I haven't really gotten too much into just the past few months so far. The main thing I know about them is they never forget. For sure. They were still killing guys over the Munich terrorist attack as late as 1997, if not later. So that was 25 years later. they were still shooting guys in alleys over that. So I think that people know that the Israelis, there's no line that they won't cross when it comes to protecting their own people or getting revenge for their own people. Mm-hmm. And so I've come across some stories, but I haven't really done a deep dive into their stuff yet, but that's for sure on the menu coming up soon. But they're incredibly impressive. They've run many ops against the United States, no question, the Walker spy ring in the Navy. So they, of course, we run ops against them, I'm certain. Everybody runs ops against everybody. That's just the way that it is in the espionage game. So they're effective. They push. They get a lot of what they want. They spy on their allies as well as their adversaries, and they're really good at what they do. And all of their knowledge is very hard won because they've had their backs to the sea. Of course, going back to World War II, we know what happened with the Holocaust, and then the immediate wars when they formed their own country in 1947. So every lesson that they have learned has been earned in blood, for sure. Yeah. So they're very, very good at what they do.
Got a saying over that way. I pursued my enemies and overtaken them. Neither did I turn back again till they were destroyed. And that, I think, represents the Israeli mentality very well.
Absolutely.
So I want to circle back again. Now, you said something before that was really summed up the whole intelligence, game, at least again from an outsider's perspective, is that you really can't trust anybody. And it's seemingly a life that would be very rightfully so paranoid. That's got to take a toll on a, whether it's an officer, case officer, clandestine officer, or an agent of theirs. It's got to just take such a psychologically a toll on always maintaining that level of secrecy, always looking over your shoulder, so to speak. It's got to just give you a little bit of PTSD.
I agree totally. It leads to paranoia. And that's a bad combination when your paranoia is justified. You know what I mean? Because you start to see things and you start to make connections if you keep your eyes open. And a lot of those connections are well-founded, and some of them are going to be, they're spurious. And it's hard for you to tell sometimes if you're not looking at intelligence reporting, for example, but you start to connect some dots in the news, and it can really just lead you down a rabbit hole for sure. There's a very famous guy named James Jesus Angleton. I don't know if you're familiar with him at all.
No.
He was the head of counterintelligence for the CIA for many years, over 20 years, I believe. And he kind of ran counterintelligence with an iron fist, and no one could touch him, really. He ultimately developed, or maybe he always had it inside him, he had malignant paranoia, I guess is the best way that I would put it. He believed in an overarching Soviet master plot that ruled everything. He believed that the Soviets were pulling the strings on every action in the world, that there was no coincidence, that anything good that happened to us was because the Soviets were giving us the tiniest win to get our hopes up. If I don't even recall if he was still alive in 1989, I have to look him up again. He probably would have said that the Soviets had allowed the Berlin Wall to come down because they wanted to put us at ease before the final strike.
Huh.
That's the kind of guy he was. But one of the reasons for that is that one of his closest friends, he was kind of an alcoholic. One of his closest drinking buddies was Kim Philby. And if you know the name Kim Philby, he was part of the Cambridge Five. And Kim Philby is probably the most damaging spy in British history. And he was the one man that James Jesus Angleton trusted above all others outside of the United States. And then that man turned out to be a Soviet spy. So you can see how that would have only fed into his nascent paranoia to begin with, and how that would have created that idea that there's nowhere you can turn where the enemy is not already there. There's nothing that the enemy doesn't already know. There's nowhere they can't get. So he is a guy that he suffered mentally, and CIA suffered because of his paranoia. There were defectors that came over, real defectors. Most people believe real defectors, and he never believed them. He always thought that they were a dangle.
Wow.
And some of that was probably true. Some of them were probably very good dangles, but not all of them. And under his leadership in counterintelligence, there was no way a defector could ever let up. They could never just live that life in the United States if they wanted, because he always thought that they were waiting to enact their plan. They've been waiting 5 years, 10 years, 15 years to enact that final Soviet plan. So he's the best example. But yeah, the paranoia really wears away at everyone, I believe.
Yeah. And, something that's always kind of fascinating to me is you see these guys come out, they retire or whatever, and they were case officers or whatever. And then all of a sudden they write a book and they come out and this is, my name and I did this and this. But isn't that the type of thing where honestly you would want to keep that a little bit under the belt? I mean, wouldn't you still worry about something happening?
Yeah, I can see that. Those people have to speak for themselves. They have to make their own decisions, of course. And I don't have any close personal relationships with any former CIA case officers. That's a great question to ask those guys. Some of them, one guy has commented on my Instagram a couple of times, and he, appears to be a legitimate former case officer who's written a book. So that's a great question for him, I think. But everything that they write has to go through a clearing process with the CIA before it can be published, because of course they don't want to spill any classified information. So I'm certain that the CIA provides a lot of edits and requires a lot of redactions. But yeah, I definitely question why someone, what's the decision process, the risk mitigation process, essentially, and putting your name out there is, look, these are the countries I operated in. These are the operations I was involved in. This is my picture. This is how many kids I have. How do you self-promote on social media for your book, for example, without putting personal information out there? They must walk that line some way, somehow. So I'm very curious how they mitigate their own risks in that way, for sure.
Yeah, that would be a good question to ask one of them. It's always bothered me. It would probably make traveling a little bit difficult for them. That's for sure.
Right. Absolutely.
So, something I wanted to ask you about was Tradecraft and kind of the development of Tradecraft through history. We've seen it. Obviously, we discussed Deuteronomy in the Bible, and the examples in the Bible are endless of espionage. And then we see throughout history the Greeks, the Romans, going way forward, even the Nazis, and then the NVA and the Soviets. It's come so far, and it continues to advance. But a lot of the very basic tradecraft stuff, dead drops, things like that, they haven't changed much. Do you think that in the future things will advance as far as that basic stuff goes, or is it always kind of going to stay the same?
Well, like we mentioned right at the beginning, human nature has been the same for millennia. So there's always going to be a way to exploit those human weaknesses, that carelessness, that lack of attention, that apathy, whatever it might be, and exploit that undeserved trustworthiness to allow for people to pass information hand to hand, face to face, voice to voice, whatever it might be. A technical collection is the majority of collection these days. There's no question about that, right? But I think that there's always going to be a place for the old-fashioned stuff. The vintage tradecraft is never going to go away entirely, because let's say, for example, that the NSA can look into your computer and see everything that you're doing, no matter how good your encryption is, no matter how good your password is. Whether or not that's possible, I don't really know. But let's say that it is. Well, what if you're not putting anything on your computer? What if you're memorizing stuff at the office? What if you're verbally passing stuff in a national park where there are no cameras, there's no satellite coverage, there's no drones, that kind of thing? There's always going to be a weakness that can be exploited by someone. So I think that there is the very real possibility that this old school tradecraft will make a resurgence, or possibly has made a resurgence already, because the easiest way to defeat technology is to not use the technology at all.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that we really see a lot of that going on with these terrorist organizations. Is you see a lot of them, doing face-to-face meetings and using that old, tradecraft stuff. I think the difference is now that we see we can track them with drones and stuff like that, but I guess they probably also have workarounds for that. So it's fascinating to see the way it advances but stays the same at the same time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So where do you see the future of intelligence gathering going? I mean, obviously you just made reference to the fact that it's going to be a lot more technical stuff, a lot more signals-based stuff. But I mean, in the future, looking in the next 20 to 50 years down the line, if you had to kind of give us something, that you might think we could see that we haven't necessarily seen yet, is there anything that comes to mind immediately for you?
There really isn't. I would say that I think that the biggest emphasis, as it is now, is going to continue to be economic espionage, because, quite frankly, you don't really need to get the inner workings of the leader of a country, the inner workings of a leader's mind, when he's putting it on Twitter 10 times a day already, for example. So open source intelligence, we haven't really talked about that yet, but open source intelligence is incredibly valuable. And that's just trolling through the internet, trolling through technical manuals, trolling through social media. All of that is very, very important these days, and is going to continue to grow in importance because we're all living our lives online most of the time as you and I are at this very moment,
Mm-hmm.
for example. So I think that the OSINT, open source intelligence, is going to be one of the biggest drivers of intelligence collection. And I think that economic information, proprietary technological information, is going to be one of the biggest targets and continue to be one of the biggest targets of intelligence collection. If you look at, have you ever heard the criticism of the United States that our defense budget far outstrips anyone else? It's bigger than all of NATO combined. It's 5 times as big as China, 10 times as big as Russia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, some of that is, defense, military industrial complex greed, of course. Some of it is grift, some of it is corruption, some of it is lackadaisical spending. But a lot of it is because we have to spend the money to develop the kind of technology that our adversaries just steal from us immediately.
Right.
So there's a reason that the old Soviet space shuttle looked exactly like our space shuttle. There's a reason that the newest Chinese stealth fighter looks exactly like an F-22 or an F-35. And it's not because great minds think alike. It's because they stole that stuff from Boeing. They stole that stuff from Northrop Grumman. They stole that stuff from NASA. They stole it all because you can put something worth $1 billion and 20,000 man hours of research. You can fit all of that on a USB and take it through the airport back to Shanghai if you want to, for example. So that's one of the big reasons why our adversaries are not spending nearly as much money in defense as we are. We also have a lot, there are other reasons, of course, it's a complex subject, but they don't need to spend that much on research when we're practically giving it away already, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah, it's crazy how these days, like you said, it's not so much that the Chinese are coming and trying to recruit a double agent from the CIA or whatever intelligence agency, but they may definitely be going after the guy working for one of the government contractors and trying to get him or get dirt on him or whatever the case may be.
Absolutely, absolutely. And every contractor has a subcontractor. That subcontractor has a subcontractor ad infinitum. So there are a lot of weaknesses that can be exploited, a lot of gaps that can be exploited in our military industrial complex for sure.
Now, I do want to just ask you this question. It might seem a little bit off the wall, but if you don't like it, just throw it back. What do you think about the coronavirus? Do you think that this was made in a lab, or do you think that it was from a bat? And then let me just top that question with, do you think that this might have been done to some degree intentionally?
I think it's more of a comedy of errors than anything else. Well, probably shouldn't call it a comedy, but that is the turn of phrase. I don't have a medical background. I haven't worked in medical intelligence at all. I do know some people that have and probably have a better hold on it than I do, but I think that the coronavirus, I do think it came out of a lab, but I think it came out unintentionally due to poor practices in the lab, poor quarantine, whatever you want to call it, for their risk mitigation inside the lab. I think it slipped out due to carelessness. I did hear a podcast a little while back that talked about that. So really, I would just be echoing another podcast if I talked about it, but it was pretty convincing. And I know that a lot of countries, including ours, do biological weapons research. And that doesn't mean that this is a bioengineered weapon, but that it came out of a lab doing that type of research. So that's what I think happened. That was something that was created for study, not for deployment. It slipped out due to negligence, and we're all dealing with the effects of that now, for sure. China being China, of course, they suppressed that information. They disappeared all of the dissidents. They disappeared anybody that was talking about it. They stopped reporting on positive cases. They stopped reporting on deaths. And they called everybody a racist for wanting to stop traffic, across the Pacific. So, certainly their practices worsened it for everybody else, no question. But I don't think that it was engineered with the intent to release and cause what we're seeing right now.
Yeah. No, I'd be right on point with you there. I will make note that it did work out sort of well in their favor to some degree. So it does remain kind of cogent in my mind, though.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's 3 months ago, and we've already stopped talking about China, quite frankly.
Right.
So we're just talking about our own missteps in containing this pandemic.
So, Justin, I really appreciate you coming on here, man. I feel like we could honestly talk for another couple hours, but I'm going to respect your time because I know you're a busy guy and you probably got a lot you're working on. But I want to ask you before I let you go, man, is there anything that you'd kind of like to let people know about yourself and about your projects that you're working on? What do you got coming down the pipeline for us on Instagram? And what can we expect to see more of in the future?
Sure. Well, typically I'm posting once a day on Instagram. I've got a good story or what I think is a good story anyway. I try to kind of jump all through different periods of history, and I talk about different instances, different incidents, different people, different gadgets. I try and touch on a wide variety of stuff. So I'm going to continue as long as I can to post once every day on Instagram under Spycraft 101. My blog is almost ready to go. I'm hoping to launch it within the next 7 days. And I have a couple of branded products and all that I'm going to put on because, quite frankly, I've been putting a lot of time and a lot of money into the research here. So I'm hoping to get some of that back anyway and at least break even on this project. And people really seem to enjoy it. So I'm hopeful that that's going to happen for sure. But, I have to say this is a real labor of love for me, just as it is for my readers. Everybody gets on board with this kind of thing, and I'm right there with them. I read these stories, I hear these stories, and I'm like, wow, I got to share that, man. That's incredible. And it's out of a love of history and a love of the United States and a love of everything that we have here and what we've had to fight and sacrifice for that kind of leads me to do it. So it's been fun, and I appreciate you. You've been one of my earliest and most fervent supporters right from the beginning, and I really appreciate this. You've kind of been there on this journey with me the whole time, I think.
Absolutely, and I will continue to be, because I really do believe in the message that you're putting out there, and I do believe that studying our history is how we are successful in the future. So, again,
Absolutely.
Thanks for your service, man. Sincerely, from the bottom of my heart, I know you guys out there, just leave it at that, do a lot for us and don't get a lot of credit for it. So thank you for that, and thank you for the page as well, man.
Hey, much appreciated, man. Take care.
Yeah, you too. Guys, until next time, please remember that you are your first and last line of defense, and I will see you in the next Tactical Podcast.